He bought an old hangar for next to nothing. In one of the containers, he found something that no one had touched for decades. The discovery changed everything in his life. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road to the outskirts of the city ran between rows of abandoned factories and cracked asphalt. Faded billboards hung at odd angles, their corners flapping in the dry wind. The man drove slowly, the hum of his old pickup filling the silence. He had not been out this far in years. The navigation signal had disappeared several blocks ago, but the place was impossible to miss. A long stretch of corrugated metal structures, roofs bent inward like tired backs, windows clouded with grime. His hangar was the third one from the end, the number almost invisible under layers of rust. He parked beside the sliding doors and sat for a while, engine idling, listening to its uneven rhythm. It had been months since he had done anything this uncertain. Buying the hangar had not been a plan, only a reaction, a way to make the last of his severance pay feel like a decision rather than slow defeat. When the plant had shut down, they had handed him a thin envelope and a pat on the back. 20 years of steady work dissolved in a 10-minute meeting. Since then, his days had blurred together. Waking late, scrolling through job listings, making instant coffee, going nowhere. The ad for the hangar had caught his eye because of its simplicity. Old industrial storage. Sold as is. Cheap. It had felt like a door cracked open, and he had stepped through before thinking too much about what might be on the other side. The key turned with resistance, and the heavy door groaned as he pushed it open. Dust rolled outward, stirred by the sudden light. The air inside smelled of iron, oil, and rain that had long since dried. For a moment, he only stood there, adjusting to the dimness, watching thin rays of sunlight spill through holes in the roof. The floor was uneven, scattered with bolts, scraps of wire, and the remnants of forgotten machines. The echo of his footsteps returned slowly, as though reluctant to acknowledge him. He walked deeper inside, brushing his hand along a workbench layered in grime. It was like entering someone else's life after decades, an untouched memory, a place sealed off from time. Tools hung on rusted hooks, boxes of nails sat half open, and against the far wall leaned what looked like the skeleton of an old compressor. He noticed tire tracks in the dust and wondered when anyone had last been here. Perhaps years. Maybe no one since the previous owner had died. In the far left corner, half hidden by stacked crates, stood a shape that caught his attention, a tall mass wrapped tightly in a heavy tarp. The fabric was dull green, its surface stiff and ridged with dust, and thick ropes crossed over it in several places. He paused, studying it. The rest of the hangar looked careless, but this was deliberate. Whoever had wrapped it had taken time, tying the knots neatly, and pulling them so tight the cords had left grooves in the material. It looked less like protection from dirt, and more like restraint. He told himself not to get distracted. There was enough work to do. Sorting, clearing, fixing the leaks. Still, as he moved through the space, sweeping broken glass and dragging out scrap metal, his eyes kept drifting back to that corner. The tarp sat there in silence, catching the faint light that shifted with the afternoon sun. At times, it looked almost human, like a figure standing motionless, watching him. By late evening, his back ached, and his shirt clung to his skin. He sat on an overturned crate, drinking from a plastic bottle of water gone warm. The light had turned amber through the roof slats, and the sound of distant traffic faded with the coming dusk. The covered object seemed larger now, heavier in the dim light. He stared at it until the thought became unbearable. What if there's something valuable under it? He had seen stories online, old cars, forgotten machines, antique furniture found in places like this. He stood, walked over, and tugged lightly at the ropes. The fibers were coarse and dry, cracking slightly under his fingers. He pulled his pocket knife from his jeans and slid it beneath the first knot. The blade sliced through with a faint snap. One by one, he cut the cords until they hung loose around the base, then grasped the edge of the tarp and lifted. Dust exploded into the air, forcing him to cough and step back. When it settled, he froze. What stood before him was not machinery or equipment, but a tall, elegant clock, a set of long case, floor-standing timepieces, the kind once found in wealthy homes a century ago. The wooden body was dark, nearly black with age, its edges carved with delicate vines and small floral patterns. A glass window revealed a brass pendulum, motionless, yet somehow alive with dull reflection. The clock's face was pale, its numbers faintly embossed, the hands frozen at 27 minutes past 2. He approached cautiously, touched the wood, and felt the cool smoothness beneath the dust. The surface was dry but solid. It had been built to last. How it ended up in a forgotten hangar was a mystery. Beneath the glass, the pendulum hung like a golden coin caught mid-swing. He moved it slightly, and the faint chime of metal echoed through the hollow body. The sound lingered longer than expected, sharp and beautiful, then faded into silence. He stepped back, studying it. The tarp lay crumpled on the floor, and the ropes coiled around his boots. The clock stood proudly, almost defiant, as though it had waited years for someone to uncover it. On the back panel, a thin layer of varnish had peeled away in strips. He noticed something odd newer screws holding part of the frame, shiny against the aged wood. Someone had tampered with it. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, typing vague phrases. Antique long case clock value, Victorian floor clock maker's marks, antique repair guide. The search results showed ornate clocks sold for tens of thousands at auctions. Most were European, handcrafted, often imported by collectors. If his clock was genuine, it could be worth more than he'd made in the last 2 years combined. The thought filled him with a mix of excitement and disbelief. For the first time in months, he felt energy something to look forward to. He printed out photos of similar models and made notes, planning to bring pictures of his find to an antique appraiser in the morning. The next day, sunlight poured through his kitchen window as he loaded the photographs into an envelope. The city was already busy, people moving quickly past him as he drove downtown. The antique store was tucked between a pawnshop and a bookstore, its window crowded with porcelain lamps and dusty vases. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wax and wood polish. The appraiser, an older man with a magnifying lens hanging around his neck, looked at the photos for a long moment before lifting his eyes. "This is a remarkable piece," he said quietly. "Late 19th century, possibly English. The workmanship, see the detailing near the base? That's not something you see in factory-made furniture. I'd estimate its value somewhere between 20 and 30,000, depending on condition." The man blinked, unsure whether to believe him. "That much?" The appraiser nodded. "If it's authentic, and the mechanism can be restored, yes." "But you said it was in a warehouse?" He hesitated, then nodded. "An old hangar I bought. It was covered up." "Strange place for something like this," the appraiser murmured. He leaned closer to the photo again, frowning. "Although, I'll tell you something interesting. The back panel looks newer. Those screws modern, not from the period. Someone's repaired or modified it recently." The man thanked him, left the shop, and stood on the sidewalk for a while, letting the words sink in. The sun was bright, the air heavy with exhaust. He should have been thrilled. After years of loss and bad luck, he had stumbled upon a treasure. But the image of the tarp and the ropes, so carefully tied, wouldn't leave his mind. Who had hidden something so valuable? And why had they sealed it like a secret? That night, He returned to the hangar. The air inside was cool, filled with the faint smell of oil and damp concrete. The clock stood where he'd left it, half illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. He walked around it slowly, fingertips tracing the edge of the frame. The screws gleamed faintly. He imagined the hands that had replaced them, working quietly in the shadows. The thought brought a strange unease, something between curiosity and dread. He sat on the crate again, the same one as before, and listened to the soft hum of wind through the broken panels of the roof. Beyond the faint noises of the city, there was nothing but traffic, no voices, just time stretching outward in silence. The clock loomed over him, still and patient. It had seen more years than he ever would. He realized that for the first time since he'd lost his job, he wasn't thinking about failure or bills or loneliness. He was thinking about time, how it passed, how it paused, how it sometimes waited. The hangar was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a beginning, though of what he couldn't yet tell. When he finally left and pulled the door shut behind him, the echo of metal on metal lingered in the air like the fading chime of an unseen bell. Inside, under the fractured light that seeped through the roof, the clock stood alone once more, unmoving, its hands forever frozen at 2:37. Waiting for him to return, rain had started in the early hours of morning, a steady whisper that drummed against the corrugated roof of the hangar and soaked the weeds that grew along the cracked pavement outside. When he arrived, the air was damp and metallic, heavy with the smell of wet concrete. His boots echoed softly as he stepped inside, and for a long moment he simply stood in the doorway, listening to the sound of water slipping through the holes above. The clock loomed in its place near the far wall, half lit by the dull gray light that filtered through the high windows. It looked both magnificent and strange, the only thing in the hangar that seemed untouched by ruin. He placed his flashlight on a shelf and approached the clock slowly, studying the details he had ignored before. The brass around the pendulum had turned a darker shade with age, but there was a faint gleam where his fingers had brushed it days earlier. The back panel drew his attention again. He remembered what the appraiser had said about the screw's modern replacements, not part of the original design. Now, in the clearer light, the difference was even more obvious. They shone too brightly against the dulled wood. Kneeling beside it, he ran a hand along the lower edge. The joints of the frame were slightly misaligned. Whoever had worked on it hadn't been careless. But the precision of the original craftsmanship made even a small imperfection visible. He hesitated, then retrieved a screwdriver from his tool bag. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed softly in the stillness as he turned the first screw. It came loose easily. Another followed, and another, until he could pull the thin panel away. Dust fell from the gap in a small gray cloud. Behind the panel, he expected the mechanism, perhaps weights or gears. But instead there was an empty cavity, deeper than the body of the clock should allow. Inside, wrapped tightly in a layer of oil-stained cloth, lay a rectangular bundle. It was wedged carefully into the space, as though someone had hidden it there with the hope that it would never be found. He slid it out and set it gently on the floor. The fabric felt dry but stiff, the folds sealed by time. When he unwrapped it, the smell of old metal and leather filled the air. Within the cloth was a worn, brown envelope made of thick material, the kind that had been used decades ago for documents meant to last. It was bound by a thin strip of leather, now brittle and nearly broken. Alongside it lay a small brass emblem round, engraved with a faded insignia that might have once represented a manufacturing company or a military division. He picked it up, brushed the dust away, and saw faint letters along the edge. They were barely legible. R.M. Engineering, 1946. He sat cross-legged on the floor, opening the envelope carefully. Inside were several folded sheets of yellowed paper, each covered with meticulous lines, measurements, and notes written in an elegant, technical hand. At first, the drawings meant nothing to him. Circles, arrows, and formulas that belonged to a world he had never been part of. But even as a layman, he could sense the precision, the intelligence behind it. Whoever had made these blueprints had known their craft intimately. One sheet caught his eye. It showed a complex assembly of gears and rods with the heading Rotational Modulator, Prototype B. Beneath it, in smaller writing, were the words, Filed for Patent, June 1947. The signature at the bottom had partially faded, but the initials were clear enough. E.H. He turned the pages slowly. There were notes written in the margins, corrections, improvements, and even a few personal remarks. One read, Delay in submission political restrictions. Must seek private registration. Another, This design ensures minimal vibration, maximum efficiency. If finalized, could revolutionize turbine systems. The meaning began to sink in. These weren't just mechanical sketches. They were patent documents, perhaps drafts of something significant. He knew nothing of engineering, but he recognized the kind of care and secrecy that surrounded valuable work. Why would anyone hide such things inside a clock? He spent hours studying them until his stomach growled and his hands ached from holding the papers too long. Before leaving, he rewrapped the bundle carefully and locked it in the toolbox he kept in the truck. Driving home through the rain, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The city looked different now, smaller, perhaps, or simply less certain. He felt as though he had stumbled into someone else's unfinished story. That night, he laid the documents out across his kitchen table. The light from the single bulb above gave them a faint amber glow, and for a long while he only stared. He typed the company name from the emblem into a search engine. Dozens of results appeared, most linking to archives and forgotten industrial records. RM Engineering had once been a mid-sized manufacturer involved in post-war aviation technology before being absorbed by a larger conglomerate in the 1950s. Some articles mentioned disputes over patents and missing documentation during the merger. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The initials EH from the drawings didn't match any name in the official histories he could find. Whoever had designed this piece had been erased or replaced. A thought came, sharp and unwelcome. If the invention had been stolen, then the designs in his possession might prove it. They were worth something, maybe even a great deal. The next morning, he printed several of the diagrams and drove to the public library. The old librarian, a man who had worked there since before the computers replaced the card catalogs, listened patiently as he explained that he was researching post-war mechanical designs. Together, they searched through databases and scanned copies of declassified technical papers. Hours passed before they found anything similar. A patent filed in 1952 by a large aerospace company, describing a mechanism almost identical to the one in his papers. He sat there, stunned. The company's version listed a different inventor's name, and the patent was still in use. The technology had become part of a widely used aircraft engine design. He realized what that meant. The papers he had found inside the clock predated the patent by several years. The man who had drawn them, this EH, had been first. When he returned home, evening had already fallen. His mind buzzed with questions. If this was true, then someone had stolen another man's work and hidden the evidence away. He imagined the person who had owned the hangar before him, the one whose name had appeared in the sale documents, perhaps related to this long-dead engineer. Had they discovered the secret and decided to protect it? Or had they simply been storing a relic they didn't understand? He could hardly sleep. His thoughts alternated between excitement and fear. What if the documents were valuable enough to attract attention? What if the company that held the patent would want them destroyed? He dismissed the idea as paranoia, but the feeling stayed with him. 3 days later, as he was repairing the hinge on the hangar door, his phone rang. The number was unknown. A male voice, calm and polite, asked about the clock. The caller said he had heard from a mutual acquaintance that it might be available for sale, and that he was willing to pay generously. When the man asked how he had gotten his number, the voice chuckled lightly and said, "People in the antique world talk." There was a pause before he added, "It would be better for everyone if that piece changed hands quietly." The call ended without agreement, but the unease it left behind lingered like smoke. Someone knew. Maybe the appraiser had mentioned it in passing. Maybe the story had traveled further than intended. That night, he checked the locks on his truck twice. The next morning, he visited a retired engineer he knew distantly, an old acquaintance from his factory days. The man had once worked in design and still kept a cluttered workshop filled with dismantled motors and yellowing technical manuals. When shown the drawings, the engineer's face tightened with surprise. "These are extraordinary," he murmured. Whoever made them was ahead of his time. "Look here, see this ratio? It solves a problem we didn't fix until the 60s. He pointed at the signature. "You say this EH filed in 47? Then this person's idea was stolen, no question." He leaned back, folding the papers carefully. "You realize what you've got, right? These could prove the company's patent is fraudulent. That would be worth millions or trouble." "Trouble?" the man asked. "Old corporations don't like ghosts coming back to life," the engineer said. "If they know you've got this, they'll want it gone. People have been silenced for less." Driving home, he replayed the words again and again. The thought of money no longer excited him. The weight of what he held pressed harder with each mile. He thought of the hidden compartment, the ropes around the tarp, the care with which someone had concealed the clock. Whoever had done it hadn't been protecting wealth, they had been protecting truth. At home, he spread the documents again and stared at the initials. He imagined a man in the late 1940s, working in a dim workshop much like his hangar, sketching ideas by the light of a desk lamp. Maybe he had believed in his invention, had trusted the wrong people, and had watched his life's work stolen. Maybe he had hidden the last proof inside the clock, the only thing he could move without suspicion. The thought left a strange heaviness in his chest. That night, as rain started again outside, and the sound of distant thunder rolled through the sky, he made a decision. He could sell the papers, find someone discreet, make enough to pay off everything he owed, and start over. No one would know, or he could find the truth. The idea frightened him. It would take time, research, perhaps confrontations he wasn't ready for. But something inside him had shifted. For years he had lived as if life had already made all his choices. Now, standing in front of the silent clock, he realized that for once, the choice was entirely his. The pendulum gleamed faintly in the beam of his flashlight. He brushed away the last of the dust and whispered to no one, "You've waited long enough." The rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof until it drowned out every other sound. He folded the papers, locked them in a metal box, and placed it beside his bed. Sleep came late, filled with uneasy dreams of gears turning, voices calling from behind walls, and a ticking that had no clock to belong to. When he awoke, dawnlight filled the room. He knew what he would do next. Somewhere, out there, a name had been erased, a story buried under decades of dust. He intended to uncover it. And as he left for the hangar once more, the city seemed quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting for him to continue what someone else had started long ago. Morning broke pale and windless, a thin fog settling over the edges of the city, as if the world were holding its breath. He had barely slept, his mind circling the same thought, until the night had worn itself thin. The documents lay folded neatly inside a small metal case on the passenger seat beside him. He drove through the quiet streets with no destination in mind at first, only a vague direction drawn by instinct. Somewhere, he believed, there had to be a trace of the man whose initials had haunted him. E.H., the one whose ideas had been stolen and buried for generations. He remembered the retired engineer's words that old corporations didn't like ghosts. But ghosts, he thought, didn't stay buried forever. The city library opened at 9, and he was waiting on the steps when the doors unlocked. Inside, the warmth and smell of paper greeted him. The same elderly librarian from before raised an eyebrow at his return. He explained that he was looking for public records, anything related to RM engineering, to early post-war aviation development, and to any engineer with those initials. The librarian nodded, perhaps out of curiosity, and disappeared among the shelves. Hours passed. When he returned, he carried a thin cardboard folder. Inside was a faded personnel ledger, a list of employees from the late 1940s. Near the bottom, the name appeared: Edward H. Lawson Mechanical Design Division, 1945 and 1948. Next to it, a note in red pencil: terminated. Reason: security transfer. There was no further detail. He traced the letters with his finger. The name meant nothing to him personally, but something inside stirred at the sight of it. It was real now, no longer just initials on a page, but a man who had existed, worked, and been erased. He copied the address listed beside the entry, an old street in the western part of town, though the librarian warned that most of those houses had been demolished decades ago. Still, he went. The neighborhood was quiet, a row of low houses from another era, the kind built with thick brick and narrow porches. Many were boarded up, some still occupied by families who had outlasted the decay. He parked at the edge of the block, comparing the numbers, until he found the one that matched. The house was small and sun-faded, but a curtain moved as he approached. A woman in her late 70s opened the door before he could knock. She had gray hair pulled into a bun, and a wary expression softened only by curiosity. "Yes?" she asked. He introduced himself hesitantly, explaining that he had come across something that might have belonged to her father. The name Lawson, he said, had appeared on old engineering papers he'd found sealed inside an antique clock. For a moment she said nothing, and then her eyes widened slightly, the color draining from her face. She asked him to come in. The house smelled of tea and dust. Photographs lined the walls, black and white portraits of men in uniforms, children playing near airplanes, a young couple standing beside a workshop. She motioned for him to sit. When he unfolded one of the diagrams and placed it gently on the table, her hands trembled. She leaned closer, touching the edge of the paper as if it might dissolve. "I know this handwriting," she whispered. "He used to draw like that every night after supper. My mother used to scold him for bringing work to the table." Her voice faltered. "They said he died in an accident at the plant, but we never saw a body. My mother stopped asking questions after the letters from the company stopped coming." He told her how he had found the clock, hidden in a hangar, wrapped carefully beneath layers of cloth and rope. She listened with tears gathering quietly in her eyes. When he mentioned that the designs had later been patented by another corporation, she nodded slowly. "He knew they were stealing from him," she said. "He told my mother once that someone at the top was taking credit for his work. Then one day he didn't come home." She looked toward the window, as if expecting to see the past walking up the path. "We thought it was an accident, but maybe it wasn't." He felt the weight of her grief settle over the room, not loud, but heavy, a silence that stretched between them. He realized then that what he held was more than evidence. It was the last piece of a life interrupted. When he left, she pressed an old photograph into his hand. It showed a man in his 40s, wearing a white shirt rolled at the sleeves, standing beside a tall, polished clock, the same clock that now stood in his hangar. The man's face was steady, proud, unaware of what would follow. "He made it himself," she said softly. "That was his way of marking time. I suppose he wanted it to outlast him." Driving back, the city blurred around him. His thoughts returned to the hangar, to the steady stillness of that clock. He parked and sat in the cab for a while before going inside. The air smelled of dust and oil again, the familiar rhythm of isolation. He walked up to the clock and looked at it with new eyes. It was no longer just a relic or a curiosity. It was a witness. Every screw, every inch of wood had been part of a story no one had cared to hear. That night, he couldn't rest. The documents lay on the table, the photograph beside them. He imagined the old man sealing his life's work inside the clock, perhaps after realizing that no one would believe him, that the only way to preserve truth was to hide it. Maybe he thought someone, someday, would uncover it and understand. The next morning, he called a local journalist whose articles he had read for years, one known for investigating industrial corruption. He expected skepticism, but when he described what he had found, the journalist's tone changed. They met the same afternoon in a small cafe near the train station. The journalist listened carefully, asked to see the documents, and spent a long time studying the diagrams before speaking. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a forgotten story. It's proof that one of the biggest aerospace companies in the country built its success on stolen work." He hesitated. "I don't want money," he said quietly. "I just want the truth to be known." The journalist nodded. "Then we'll verify it first, carefully. Once we publish, you'll have to be ready for attention, and not all of it will be kind." Over the following weeks, the investigation began. The journalist connected with historians, patent experts, and archivists who confirmed that the early patent submissions from Lawson's era had indeed disappeared. Cross-referencing showed that the later company's filings contained identical technical phrasing and identical mechanical ratios, too precise to be coincidence. Each discovery tightened the net of truth. As the article neared completion, whispers spread. An anonymous email arrived in his inbox, offering him a substantial sum for the documents. No questions asked. The sender claimed to represent a private collector, but the language was corporate, polished, rehearsed. He deleted it without replying. 2 days later, a black car idled briefly outside the hangar, its engine running before driving off. He told himself it was nothing, but he began locking the doors more carefully. When the story finally appeared, it caught attention far beyond the local press. National outlets picked it up, headlines proclaiming, "Forgotten engineer's work," stolen by major corporation evidence hidden for decades. The photograph of the clock accompanied every article, its silent face now a symbol of time restored. Reporters camped outside his hangar, asking for interviews he refused to give. The daughter of Edward Lawson appeared on television, holding her father's photograph with quiet dignity. The aerospace company issued denials, then partial acknowledgments, and finally a statement promising an internal review. The weeks that followed were chaotic. Lawyers contacted him, journalists kept calling, and strangers sent letters of gratitude and outrage alike. Yet amid the noise, he felt an unexpected calm. The truth, once fragile and hidden, had found light. The clock in the hangar ticked again, the pendulum swinging slowly after he'd had it repaired. Each chime felt like an echo of the man who built it, a small defiance against silence. He received one more visit before the world began to move on. The daughter of Lawson came to the hangar on a quiet afternoon. She looked smaller than before, tired, but peaceful. Together, they stood before the clock. "He would have liked you," she said softly. "You did what he couldn't." He shook his head. "He did it. I just happened to open the door." She smiled faintly. That's all history ever needs. Someone willing to open a door. After she left, he spent the evening cleaning the workshop, clearing the space of debris and dust. The hangar, once an empty shell, began to look like a workshop again. He built shelves, repaired the roof, and restored old tools he found in the corners. Slowly, it became something more than a shelter. It became purpose. He began taking on small restoration jobs, repairing furniture, clocks, anything that carried history within it. Every morning, he started his workday when the first beam of sunlight touched the clock's glass face. He would pause for a moment to listen to its ticking, steady and unhurried. It no longer mattered how much time had passed or what he had lost before. In that quiet rhythm, he heard something resembling peace. Months later, he received a letter from a museum dedicated to industrial history. They were planning an exhibition titled The Unsung Innovators and wanted to include the clock as a centerpiece, along with Lawson's restored documents. He agreed without hesitation. When the day came to deliver it, he ran his hand over the polished wood one last time. The clock gleamed softly, no longer burdened by secrecy. As he watched the museum workers loaded into the truck, he felt neither regret nor pride, only gratitude. The hangar was empty again, but it no longer felt hollow. He had learned that truth, like time, never truly stopped. It waited, patient and persistent, for someone brave enough to uncover it. That night, sitting alone in the quiet space, he listened to the faint echo of his own breath and the distant hum of traffic beyond the walls. The rain began again, tapping gently against the roof. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost or what might come next. He was simply there, surrounded by silence that no longer felt like loneliness. Somewhere deep in his memory, he imagined Lawson's clock striking once more, its chime stretching through the decades, a sound that no longer belonged to secrecy or sorrow, but to truth finally found, and to the quiet strength of a man who, against all odds, chose to do the right thing. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more true stories like this one. Watch the next video and share this one with someone who would understand.